First of all, I'm Susie Spickle, and I am um, the Community Programs Director here at the Harris Center and one of the naturalists, and I am a complete otter fan. I love otters so much, and I'm pretty sure that if you signed up for tonight's talk, you too are an otter lover. And I just want to give a really big shout out for Miriam's book, which has just come out here. It's a fabulously, wonderfully written book. It's lyrical, it's insightful, it's beautiful. It will make you want to travel the world and see all the otters that she has. And we are so lucky to have Miriam here. She says she has been obsessively tracking and writing about wildlife ever since she was small, which I can relate to. And as you can tell, Miriam is not from around here. She was born in Lewes, Sussex, and has lived in London and France, and for 5 years lived on St. Mary's on the Isle of, and how do you say that, Miriam? The
It's the Isles of Scilly.
No, the
Yes,
Isles of Scilly. I
yes,
might I might have to go there.
I think so.
That's
Everybody should
great.
go there.
I just love it.
Not as silly as it sounds.
She lives now in Devon, England, and she was a school teacher until she escaped that life. And I love that because I know a lot of school teachers who dream of escaping that life too, and became a full-time writer. And she teaches creative writing at Plymouth University. And I just want to say that this book was a real pleasure to read, and a lot of people are describing it as part travelogue, part close reading of a wild otter. It's an emblem of nature and conservation, and the otter, her book Otter Country, puts the animal right at the center. And we are so thrilled to have you here. Thank you so much, Miriam.
Thank you so much, Susie, and apologies for the mix-up about the different time zone. I suppose it's quite natural that that might happen. It might be a risk coming from the UK and not being very good at maths. But anyway, I'll launch straight into my talk about why I wrote this book, Otter Country, where the idea came from, my background, and I'm going to take you through some otter facts and science, which you all will probably be very familiar with, my learning journey about otters, and also my childhood start. You know, why otters? Why did this happen? How does somebody become obsessed with a creature? And what impact does that have then throughout their life? And how can we give that out into the world and create something that really makes a difference to people and the way they feel about the natural world? And that was really my drive to write a book which was part memoir, part science, and that inspired people to go out into the natural world, to learn about it, to cherish it, and to come back with a deeper sense of our connection with animals, with these creatures who I think of as our kin. So when I was very young, I had a really interesting mixture of a scientist father and a literary mother. And this stood me in good stead for getting interested in the natural world. They were both natural historians. We spent a lot of time outside, living in a small town in the southeast corner of England, surrounded by countryside and rivers. However, there were not any otters left at that time. I didn't know this, but otters were nearing extinction in the UK. They'd been poisoned and polluted by the use of organochlorine pesticides and pollutants. And otters had bit by bit been dying, been disappearing from our landscape. And this is one of our last large carnivores. Large, I say large. I know in the US, you have some spectacular wildlife. In the UK, our wildlife is more subtle, but no less fascinating. So why the wild otter? Well, I saw this creature to begin with as a kind of teacher, and it had something to say, and it seemed to be calling out loud. Otters had this miraculous journey from being nearly extinct in Britain to making a miraculous comeback. And I wanted to show how when we work together, something amazing can happen. When we see something that we've nearly lost and we work together to bring it back. Because of course, I think one of the problems with wildlife conservation is we always seem to wait till something is nearly extinct before we start to realize and wake up and think, actually, we quite love this creature and we need it, and it's an integral part of the ecosystem. How can we rescue it? We love to be rescuers. So that aside, I wanted to also tell the story of how a child would become engaged in the natural world. So it started with a desire to go on a journey around this small archipelago, and a watery odyssey, a water level odyssey, if you like, to explore the land where I lived and to then expand that into a wider map of Britain and look at the otter's conservation status. And I saw Britain as a map then of blue veins, which were the otter's habitat. And I wanted to get down into the otter's world, to look at the world from an otter nose level, if you like, from the whisker level, in order to understand it. Because I had no idea. When I first started this journey and when I was a child, I'd never seen an otter. They were very rare, very rare. And this was, well, in the 1980s when I was growing up. As I said, they were not there. So where I live, in Devon now, in the southwest of England, the landscape is rocky. When it rains, the rivers turn into spate and they flood. And Dartmoor, which is the picture here you can see, is a rocky granite outcrop, which was ideal for otters because we weren't able to cultivate it. So you can see the little field systems there. These are for livestock, which basically lived an organic life grazing, and no pollutants were really going into the rivers. So Dartmoor, where I went to live, had very pure, clean water. And when otters started to be threatened in different parts of the country, the otters kind of stayed safe high up on the uplands, the granite outcrop of Dartmoor, and lived in the clean water. And then when other otters disappeared from the rest of the landscape, otters were still breeding on Dartmoor. It was an enclave. And slowly, when we cleared up the rivers, the state of the rivers, otters started to recolonize. So it's from Dartmoor, where I live now. And I went to live there very, very deliberately, because I knew that I had more chance of seeing otters there than in the other part of Britain where I grew up, which was in the southeast. So this is the southwestern tip, the little kind of arm of Britain that goes out into the Atlantic, and where people left Plymouth to sail over to the United States from. So it's that western tip that's reaching out into the Atlantic towards the US. It's quite a nice image. And what the landscape looks like where I live, these lovely spate rivers. This is the River Dart. My town is on the River Dart. And apologies for my dog, who photobombs every single picture I take. He's always with me. He's a collie. Very good companion, believe it or not, when you're searching for otters, because he's very obedient. I know he doesn't look like that there, but he'll stay back, he'll crouch down, and he can actually tiptoe as well. So this helps when watching for otters. So this is my landscape, my otter country, the rivers that pour off Dartmoor in the southwest of England. But what initially attracted me as a child was stories. From a very young age, my parents read me, particularly my mother, who's very literary, shared animal stories with me. Tarka the Otter, which people might have heard of, was written in 1927 as a very dramatic story of the life of an otter in Devon. Now, you'd be forgiven for thinking that it's not a children's book, because Tarka the Otter is a violent story where the otters are persecuted and hunted. And I'm no spoilers, but Tarka does not have a very good end. And as a 10-year-old child, of course, that mobilized my sense of injustice. This beautiful creature, I'd actually become one. Well, I would defy anyone not to become an otter when reading this story. It's absolutely immersive. Beautiful, beautiful story. I was an otter for a while, so of course I wanted to protect them. Coming out of this story, they were hunted in the 1980s in Britain and nearing extinction. I looked for the otters near my home. There weren't any. I wanted to see an otter, none. So that mobilized me, along with reading other books. This is an author called Philip Ware, who was one of the first otter conservationists in Britain. Actually, that otter species there are 13 species in the world. You'll recognize that is a North American river otter, actually, and you can tell the difference because of very subtle different nose shape. It has a slightly triangular nose, whereas the British otter you'll see in a minute, or the Eurasian otter technically, all across Europe and Asia, has a slightly more sort of snub upturned, quite a cuter kind of upturned nose. So yeah, this is an extract from this immersive story that affected me so powerfully. Absolutely lyrical, seductive prose, which not only gives you a beautiful experience of listening and reading, but also seduces you into the otter's world and the otter's mind and its landscape and its ecology. The moon rose up 2 hours before dawn, and the shaken light on the water gladdened the otter, for she was young, and calling to the dog with a soft flute-like whistle, the song of the river, hastening around leaning Willow Island, stole into the holt and soothed her. Time flowed with the sunlight of the still green place. The summer drake flies, whose wings were the most delicate transparent leaves, hatched from their cases on the water and danced over the shadowed surface. So this rather seductive, beautiful prose draws you in. And I really do believe that it's story that can convince people, perhaps more than anything else, more than a lecture, more than a talk. It's story that human beings respond to. And that's certainly what happened to me, particularly because this last paragraph depicts the hunting scenes towards the end of the book. And it's so poignant because this is a young otter, the son of Tarka. He sprang up as soon as he fell, snapping and writhing as more jaws bit onto his body. He was being pursued by hounds. And Williamson cleverly evokes this scene of horror along with the beauty and grandeur of the landscape. Among the brilliant hawkbits, little sunflowers of the meadow, he was picked and dropped among the screaming whoops and cheers of sportsmen. So, what child could not be affected by that? And there's 250 pages of it. So you come out seriously changed. And what happened then was I found out what was going on with otters, and I started my own campaign. And my own campaign publication, Otter News, summer 1979. And it encompassed the whole of my street. An early activist. I wanted to, tell people, raise awareness, even then at the age of 10, 11, 12, what was going on with the otter. And I think partly because of that and the conservation work that had been going on, the otter received protected status. Wasn't due to me, but the work that was going on, and I sort of tuned into that, and the otter was then protected and no longer hunted. So why the otter? What makes it special? Why so seductive? Well, you can see from this lovely picture from Charlie Hamilton James, who's a British filmmaker and conservationist. that the otter has this magical quality about it. It has a rather human-like face with these large eyes and snub nose. You could see there that I was describing earlier in comparison to the American river otter. This otter is a Eurasian otter, and it has a sort of more turned up nose. And when it swims, you can see there that the nose is slightly retroussé, and it's leaving a ream, pushing a ream of water in front of its nose, and its eyes and ears are perfectly aligned on the same plane, on the plane of the water. So it's designed to be stealthy, camouflage. It's a predator. It's not for cuteness. This is a predator. This is an otter this is an animal that needs to hide and to hunt by stealth. So that explains the appearance, and the vibrissae, the stiff whiskers you can see there, beautifully shown in the photograph, will pick up electromagnetic field from fish underwater. So when it's swimming, it can sense fish. It can also blow out little air bubbles. Charlie Hamilton James discovered this. The otter will blow out little air bubbles and breathe them back in again when it's under the water. So it's using its scent as well as its feeling, its touch, its senses of touch and smell. And the eyes have a special membrane so they can see underwater. So that's a bit of science for you. Here's some poetry. Ted Hughes, poet laureate in Britain, wrote this iconic poem in 1960. Underwater eyes, an eel's oil of water body, neither fish nor beast is the otter, four-legged yet water-gifted, to outfish fish. With webbed feet and a long ruddering tail, and a round head like an old tomcat, brings the legend of himself before wars or burials, in spite of hounds and vermin poles, does not take root like the badger, wanders, cries, gallops along land he no longer belongs to, re-enters the water by melting. But what's so interesting for me about this poetry is that Ted Hughes manages to capture the movement and feel and being of the otter's physical presence, but also he picks up on the way the otter is scientifically water gifted to outfish fish. So there's a wonderful blend of science and nature in this poem, and then history, socio-cultural aspects as well, with the vermin poles that used to be used to spear the otter when it was hunted, and doesn't live underground like the badger. So comparison with other creatures. So children, it's not a children's poem, but again, children reading this would get a real sense and feel of this creature. And I think it's the feeling we get in the body, which is so important when we want to make a connection, whatever connection we can, with this creature. And the end of this poem that I haven't put up because it's too long, the end of the poem finishes with all the marvelous aspects of the otter, and finishes with it described as nothing more than a pelt over the back of a chair. And that's the last line of the poem. And we see, you know, this is finally what humans have done to this creature. And of course, that mobilizes the emotions. So, yeah, they're not for cuteness. Otters are, and I'm a campaigner for this idea, otters are ferocious, absolutely ferocious predators. They've got the strongest bite of any animal for their size. And if you look at the jaws here, this otter has caught a pike, which, looking at that picture, is probably much larger than itself. And you can see it seems to be easily swimming along, just having kind of grabbed the pike by its nose and just happily swimming away with it. And the pike can't resist. And you can see those sharp, carnivorous teeth there, which just are so perfectly designed, and as well the marvelous vibrissae again, which is when if you ever get the chance to be close to an otter, and I wouldn't recommend getting too close because we have to make sure not to disturb them, and sometimes it's only photography which can give us the real close-up view. But the otter has this incredible set of walrus whiskers, which do look completely extraordinary if you happen upon one, and you can see you get nose to nose, as happened a couple of times on my otter adventures. So otters often come to grief at our hands, as I've said, and otters' predator now is cars. In this country, in Britain, where I live, otters come out, they're nocturnal. So in the winter, they come out at rush hour when people are commuting home often. And in bad weather, when the rivers rise, the spate rivers that I was talking about, they will get hit by cars because they have to cross the road instead of going under the bridges that they might usually take. And so the rivers are flooded. They've no space for them to go under rivers, under the bridges. So they have to come out and they get hit by cars. And this otter was one that I helped with. It was being rescued because its mother had been hit by a car, and the cubs were terrified and hiding by the side of the road, too afraid to leave. And this one luckily was rescued. And you can see its funny goggly eyes that all young otters have. But again, we had to microchip this creature. And I said, can I hold him? And they said, you don't want to hold a young otter. They really do not want to be held. And I'm not talking about the wriggling. I'm talking about the teeth. You have to wear chainmail gloves, to hold a creature like this. And it was also extremely aggressive and extremely loud. Yeah, it was fear, but they're very, very good at putting on a show of aggression if they need to. And this otter is only a few weeks old, and it was microchipped so we could track its progress and released back into the wild. There are problems with this in Britain. We don't have very much space, very different from the United States. So if a river is at capacity for otters, which nowadays, happily, they are, many rivers in Britain are, have a certain amount of otters per river. And if you introduce one back in the wrong place, they'll just get bitten to pieces and attacked, and there's no point. So we have to very, very carefully decide where they need to be released, usually close to where they've come from. But like I say, it's a risk, and the otter has to then take its chances and avoid the new otters that have come on the block. But this one did well when it was released. So I was talking about the otter's horizontal alignment. And this is an otter skull. Now, I was given an otter skull to hold when I was a child by my grandfather, who was a biologist, and his house was just an Aladdin's cave of skulls and bones and skeletons, and stuff that he'd collected from the natural world. Now, these days, because the otter is protected, you have to have a license to have any part of an otter. And this is obviously to avoid people thinking, oh, well, maybe I'll just pick up this otter and have it, and to have it stuffed or have its bones. You can't do that. You can't have any part of an otter. So I've got a license to have this otter skull. And my grandfather gave me this, and he said to me, this creature was here before us. This is millions of years of evolution, honed for perfection. And you can see its flat skull and the incredible teeth and the little holes for where the nerve endings for the whiskers would have been, and the large eye sockets, but all on this wonderful horizontal plane that the otter has evolved to create this fantastic water dynamic aquiline kind of shape. Otters are spiritual creatures as well. You can see this one doing yoga, it's morning prayer. Um, I joking aside, this it is a lovely illustration. You can see the webbed feet and the beautiful waterproof fur there, the webbed feet, the five toes, they're like little hands and they can hold their prey as they're feeding, and they often do, like, as you know, lie on their backs and chomp up whatever it is that they've caught. My theory is that otters evolved in this country or in this part of Europe to feed on eels. And if you've ever seen an otter hunting, especially hunting an eel, you can hardly distinguish the lithe, supple, deft way both creatures move. And I've watched otters at close range underwater and seen how an otter really does resemble an eel. So the other amazing thing of watching otters in the wild is how dissembling the coat is when it's wet. Otters are very, very good at hiding. And this photo by my friend Andy Coventry, who very kindly, I'm not a photographer, these photos aren't mine, they're his. He gave me this photograph, and you can see the way that the coat catches the light. It makes it, if you don't know, if you aren't watching, you would not see this creature. You would miss it, because the light on the coat has caught the water in such a way as the water and the fur are indistinguishable. And you can see that marvelous hand there, the otter's front paws with the claws there. In marshy areas where I live in the southwest of England, around the estuaries and down towards the sea where the ground is soft, otters have very long nails. And in more rocky areas, their toes get more contact with the rocks, and their nails get worn down and naturally filed. So you can often see the claws in the muddy footprints in the silt in my part of the country, but you can't always, those don't always show up. So if you're interested in otter tracking, you may, and I'll show some prints in a moment, you'll see that you know, if the mud isn't very soft, the claws just won't show up. There are 5 toes, but often one of the toes and the claws don't show up. The webs don't show up either often, unless it's really gooey, and you'll see in a moment. Here we are. So the top left picture, we have 2 dog footprints. So you could see that's it wasn't my dog, but it's probably a medium-sized dog, but a collie or a big spaniel. And next, that's going one way, and coming the other way are 3 otter prints, and you can see the hind foot is longer, and you can see its webs there and its splayed claws as it's moving quickly across the mud. And there its front paws, 5 toes, and the smaller pads kind of superimposed on each other as it's trotting up the mud and silt. And then there's a lovely big splodgy hind paw at the bottom right there. This is in the mud and silt where I live, the estuarine mud lower down on the River Dart as it flows out towards the sea. And bottom left is perhaps all you might ever see of an otter, which is its tail as it disappears because it's seen you. They do not like to be seen. And if you do get seen by an otter, they're actually very short-sighted, and they will notice more your movement and your smell, and if you're making sounds, but they don't see very well. So if it does catch sight of you, it kind of look at you like this and make this extraordinary noise, which I call a huff, which I've written about in my book. And they kind of go a bit like a cat spitting, a little bit like that. But when I first encountered this sound, it was in the dark, so the otter couldn't see me, and I couldn't see the otter. And all I could hear was this strange sound, and I thought it was a sheep with a smoker's cough I said, what is this sound? I hadn't thought that the otters made that sound. This is early on in my search, and it was kind of, and the otter was really close to me, and it must have been like wondering, what is that? What is that big creature? Is it a bear? Is it a deer? Is it a wild boar? It really was a very quizzical sound, and it was only when I heard recordings of them that I realized that I'd been really close to this creature and not realized what it was. So they are elusive and beguiling. This otter is porpoising. You can see how very little body fat it has on its streamlined body. I have a theory that North American otters are actually a bit bigger, and more kind of hefty than European otters. But I haven't had that theory proven. But if you look at this one, you can see its ribs. You can see how thin it is. I mean, they live on a knife edge. They do not have much body fat. They have to be constantly on the move and constantly hunting until they've had their fill, and then they can go and sleep. Like most predators, they will just sleep and rest to digest their prey. But this otter is porpoising, and it's an economical way of traveling through the water, where just like a porpoise or a dolphin, it can move up or down river, and it can move more quickly, like that. It's not for, I don't think it's for fun. I think it's an economical, energy efficient way of traveling. And you can see lovely, really clearly and beautifully, the otter's having a breath. Its little mouth is open as it dives back down into the water. So what got me interested was Tarka the otter, but then at the beginning of my search, Ring of Bright Water, the story that was written in the early 60s by Gavin Maxwell. And I went on this journey up to the west coast of Scotland where this was written, because I knew that on the west coast of Scotland, otters are diurnal, because in the rest of the UK, otters really generally only come out at night unless there's some kind of problem, particularly in, you know, a highly populated landscape. They really need to make more effort to keep hidden. And sometimes we see the young ones before they've learned any different. They don't know to stay hidden out during the day, but usually they're just out at night. In Scotland, it's a different matter because they can feed on the coasts where it's tidal, and the feeding is best according to the tide, whatever point of the tide it is, and they will come out and they're visible in the sea, in the daylight. So I went up with my copy of Ring of Bright Water that I'd had since a child, and went to look. And it was only when I got to Scotland that I saw my very first otter, because it was daylight. And I was in a camper van, and I just parked up, and it was midsummer. And I parked up, I'd driven all the way from about kind of, I don't know, 12 hours driving or something from where I lived at my home, and parked up as close to the water as I could. And I was woken up by this sound. It was crunching, this rough kind of crunching, gravelly. And I thought, what is that? And I looked out, and there was an otter eating a crab right by my camper van. And it was then that I realized that, of course, camper vans are the best kind of wildlife watching mobile, because the otters don't know you're in there. They just don't take it for anything human at all. So yeah, so I saw my very first otter on the west coast of Scotland. And I went searching to Camasfiena or Sandaig Bay, where Gavin Maxwell famously lived with otters. He had pet otters, captive otters, when he was young in the 1960s. And of course, in those days in Britain, you could have wild animals as pets. Now you can't. And also, otters do not make very good pets. They communicate by biting with their teeth, and as they grow older, they get grumpier and more bolshy, and they will bite your fingers off. And this happened to I think it's the young man in the picture, actually. Terry Nutkins had 3 of his fingers chopped off by an otter, and never got them back, unfortunately. And he got gangrene as well. So I wouldn't recommend keeping otters. But worse than that is that when a predator is kept by people or comes close to people, generally the animal comes off worse. So we may get bitten, but worse things will happen. So this kind of sad conflict can happen between predators and humans, where it's just dangerous for a creature to be anywhere near us. With the best intentions in the world, otters are best, in the wild, away from us, if at all possible. This was one of the seducing moments for me with reading Ring of Bright Water. Gavin Maxwell's description of watching his otter Midgebill swimming in a glass tank that he'd built for himself, and to watch the otter in so he could sketch it. His speed was bewildering. His grace was breathtaking. He was boneless, mercurial, sinuous, wonderful. I thought of a trapeze artist, a ballet dancer, a bird, or an aircraft acrobatics. But in all these, I was comparing him to lesser grandeurs. He was an otter in his element, and he was the most beautiful thing in nature I'd ever seen. So, yeah, I mean, what can you say? I had to see one after that. So I went to Sandaig Bay, and there's a wonderful memorial to Edal, who was another one of Gavin Maxwell's otters. Now, Midgebill was killed by a road worker because people were very hostile to otters in the 1960s and felt they were vermin. They took our fish. We've changed our attitude hugely now. Edal died in a house fire. So, you can see what I was saying is it's not a good idea to keep them around us. Much better off in the wild, if at all possible. It's good to rehabilitate them and release them. That's what we need to do, not keep them, if at all possible. So this is an incredible picture. When I was doing my research, I was looking into this kind of joint sociocultural history of humans and otters. And this is a Bronze Age petroglyph that was found in Norway. And you can see that at the bottom of the picture are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 otters all standing up. And I'm not quite sure what the person is doing. It might be a shamanic ritual, but generally otters don't often stand up like that unless they're being fed by humans. They might stand up briefly to look, but generally I've never actually seen an otter in the wild doing that, and I've conferred with other otter experts in this country, and they've said, yeah, they don't really do that in the wild, not often. So these otters may well have been somehow domestic otters. It's a really interesting question, and of course we can't know, but that picture absolutely intrigued me and shows that our connection with these animals goes back for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. Once we were more connected and we were living close to these creatures and knew them intimately. But as you can see from the wary look on this otter's face, they don't like us. And it's best not to get close to them. This is an otter in Somerset, near where I live, and the ice is frozen, and the otter is wanting to hunt but not coming out because it can see that the photographer is there looking straight at you. This is an aside. It's a horrible picture of an otter hunt by Edwin Landseer, who was Queen Victoria our great monarch from the 19th century, Queen Victoria's favorite painter. And interestingly, you can see the otter being speared there, absolutely barbaric, with the baying hounds, very dramatic picture with the heroic hunter pouring with sweat as he holds the otter aloft in victory, and the baying hounds are agreeing. And you can see the justification for this, which is on halfway down, I think on the right, there are two fish there, which the otter has obviously been stealing. And there is its punishment. So quite a shocking, depiction of how we used to view these creatures and how we thought it was okay to treat them. But in my research, I also wanted to look at this, how our attitudes have evolved and changed and developed. And happily now, we have, oh, this is not such a happy picture either. We have a better attitude to them. Often the only evidence we have that there are otters in the area is that they get run over. And during my studies, I found out that there's a project which picks up, and you'll have these in the States too, I'm absolutely sure, which picks up and checks out and does, we call them autopsies on all the dead otters that are found, and they're always found on the roads. And I went along and decided that I was going to learn a bit more about otter autopsy science. And I showed up as a volunteer at Cardiff University, which is in Wales. And they gave me a white jacket and immediately assumed that I was some kind of student who wanted to help with the autopsy. And I hadn't prepared myself at all for this. I thought I knew it was going to be an autopsy, so I'm quite squeamish, so I'd had to prepare myself by watching, emergency veterinary programs and detective stories where there are autopsies on TV, and I thought I'd really well prepared myself. Not. So what I wasn't prepared for was the smell of composting otter that has been in the fridge for a few weeks or lying by side road and then put in the freezer. So they defrost these otters and dissect them and look at the toxicology of every single organ. So I was expected to weigh and measure the spleen, the kidneys, the heart. And what an experience holding an otter's heart. I came away from this experience with a lot more knowledge, but when I got on the train, I thought, well, I've been really courageous. I've faced my fear, and I got on the train home, and about 2 hours later, I realized that I was going completely the wrong direction. So, I hadn't actually maintained, but I think I was probably in shock, so I hadn't maintained my calm. Susie, how are we for time? I can't remember what time, how much longer have I got? Because I can't remember what time we're supposed to be finishing my
Good
talk.
question. Maybe you have about another 15 minutes.
Okay.
So if you want to begin to wrap it up, I'm sure there'll be questions, but this is so good. I could listen to you talk about otters for like the rest of my life. But that might just be me. So about another 15 minutes.
Okay. Right. So yes, this is another of Andy Coventry's pictures. So I didn't want to finish with, otter death and otter post-mortem or autopsies, and the sad story. Otters have made a miraculous comeback in this country, in the UK, as I said. Every 10 years, there's a national otter survey. I don't know whether, I mean, the country is small enough for us to be able to do that. I don't know. I mean, you might do it in the US state by state or some such, because it's such a vastly different size from the UK. But in the UK, what we did was we divided the whole country up into a little map of a grid of squares. And then volunteers and otter experts each took a tiny square on the grid, and surveyed the river or the wetland for otters. Now, how do you get amateurs to look for otters when they don't really know what they're doing? Well, the way we do it is by looking not for the actual otter swimming under your feet like this one, but looking for otter poo. And otter spraint, we call it. I'm not sure if you have the same name in the US. There might be a different name for it, but otter spraint is very particular. It's oily and black. It has fish scales and bones, and it smells very particular. So you can identify, if you know what you're looking for, if you've seen an example, and you'll know what it is instantly. But normally on my talks, I bring an example. I bring a little pot of poo, poop, as you call it, and get people to have a sniff. And would you believe it? Most people will cooperate with that, and they'll have a little sniff, and they go, "Oh yes, okay." So otter poop smells perfumey. It smells like slightly bergamoty, kind of lavendery. It actually smells. No one ever believes me. It smells nice. I promise. Now, maybe otters are different in the US, but I can't think why they would be. So, if you're looking to track otters, the first thing you need to look for is their poo. And you'll be able to find it on the otter loo. Now, an otter loo is where, what do you call toilets? It's very late at night for me. Restroom. Or some such. Otters have their restrooms, which are on a rock, a particular rock which is above the waterline, and they will always leave their droppings or spraint there for other otters to come along and check out. And this spraint contains all the otter language, whether they're ready to mate, whose territory it is, everything another otter needs to know. What they've been eating. It could be all kinds of things that we don't even know in that otter spraint. And there are, in fact, scientists who are looking into it in all its wonderful detail, whole PhD thesis just on otter poop. So the National Otter Survey identified how many otters there were per river, per little grid square, in every river, in every county, in every region of England, and then Wales as well. And we managed to make an estimate for how many otters there were. And every 10 years, we can see how the otters are doing. It's not exact, but it gives us a pretty good estimate as to how many otters there are. And in recent years, since Brexit, I'm sorry to say, we don't have the same laws for protecting our water system anymore. So the European water directives have all gone. So what's happened? Is that the waters, the sea and the ocean around the coasts and the rivers have become vastly more polluted again. And the knock-on effect is huge damage to the environment. So that's very sad. And in some areas, otters have started to decline again. The indications are the National Otter Survey for Wales has just been published, and the indications are that in some areas otters are starting to suffer again, and it's all because of Brexit. So sadly, we need to look into it. We can't afford to take our eye off the ball. We can't afford not to keep watching and doing the science and keeping an eye, a weather eye on this barometer, because the otter is a barometer, the health of our rivers. So, we're constantly presented with challenges to how we might look after the environment. And the otter, being the apex predator, will show us how the rivers are doing, because they will disappear if we pollute. And it's as simple as that. So, yeah, where I live, the rivers are quite clean, luckily, and so we do have an enclave of thriving otters. I encountered one at Christmas time, and I'd gone for a walk in the woods near where I live, and I wasn't feeling well, and I thought I wouldn't go to the river, and I had my dog with me as usual, but he ran down to the river, and I couldn't call him back because it was stormy and the river was in spate. So I had to go down and find him. There he was in the water, lying down like he does. And all of a sudden I heard this whistling sound. The whistle that the otter makes is designed to travel across the water, like the kingfisher, all these water animals who have these very high-pitched whistles. And I heard this whistle and I thought, that's an interesting kingfisher. It's very loud. And then I realized that there was an otter coming. So I just stayed put. The river was in flood, an absolute spectacular flood. This mother otter came shooting past us, ignored the dog, jumped out of the river. But she carried on calling, and I could hear another call, and I could see that her cubs had been swept away. It was very dramatic. One cub came after her, jumped out of the water, and I couldn't work out the tussle of joy or chiding that went on. And then another otter cub arrived, and the three of them went off on land because the water was obviously so dangerous. But I couldn't work out whether they were actually enjoying themselves or it was dangerous, because they've got this whistle and they seemed very excited. It was almost as if the cubs were saying, "That was great, Mum, can we do it again?" She was giving them swimming lessons in the worst possible conditions. So animals do this, and it can be quite horrifying and emotional to watch. But it taught me something, which is these young cubs could cope with this incredible storm surge in the river. So there we are. That was my latest otter encounter, only at Christmas. Again, this is another of Andy's photographs, which is so beautiful. You can see an otter coming out in the sunlight. Amazing picture of its whiskers, its vibrissae, again there. And the beautiful svelte coat that shines with light as it comes out. Almost cat-like ears. We think of them as having tiny ears, but they look a little bit cat-like. And if you get close to an otter, you'll see that they do look a bit more prominent than we'd think. I've got to the end of my slides. I think that might be good timing. That's an otter disappearing under the ice. Yeah, and there's more of my stories and science and hints for otter tracking and how you might go about getting close to otters, or finding them, at least finding their signs, and actually see one. You know, this book actually conjures otters. If you read it, you will see otters in the wild, but I'm sure many of you have already, and I'd love to hear any questions or any stories that people want to put forward now.
So much, Miriam. That was completely delightful and inspired, and you're getting some applause. If you want to stop sharing your screen, we can see, might be able to see other people, and there are some questions that people have. And I just want to say again, what a fabulous presentation that was, and to hear your passion come through. And I wish that I lived close to you, because I would hug you. I love all the same books growing up, and it set me on a path of loving otters. And I do want to agree that when you read this book, it does conjure up otters, because I was reading it and I live across from a pond and I'm always looking for otters. I rarely get to see them, but I went down early one morning with my dog and I heard the huffing and chuffing sound you described. And there were two otters swimming up the shoreline. And I'm pretty sure, now that you mention it, it might have been the magic of your book. So yay. All right, here's a couple of questions for you. Can you talk a little bit more about how poor water quality impacts the otter, and why where you live in Dartmoor, there wasn't as worse water quality?
Yeah, sure. So great question. And it's a really important one too, because we all have to keep an eye on our water quality. It's absolutely key. And what happens is, with agriculture, the chemicals that we put on the fields all wash down into the water system, from the watershed all the way down over the fields and into the rivers. And everything that we put on our roads, in our landfills, everything that doesn't get recycled, it leaches down into the water system. And then what happens is the water quality acidifies or silts up and becomes less oxygenated, so that the fish can't thrive. And the insects and the whole ecosystem, from invertebrates to fish to mammals, is impacted. So we cannot afford to be doing this. We have to find ways of preventing the pollution going into the rivers. And in this country, one of the recent solutions, very exciting, has been the reintroduction of another animal that was actually extinct, which is the beaver. And the beaver creates, the ecosystem engineer creates cleaner, filtered water systems. And the British public have been quite resistant to this, because this is a big animal, and we're not used to big animals. And they reorganized the landscape. And of course, in England and Wales, we are so densely populated, and the farmland goes right down to the river's edge. So people have been very resistant to allowing beavers back. But some conservationists, I shouldn't be proud to say this, but they got tired of waiting for the government to say, yes, it's okay, you can have beavers. So they just released a whole bunch of beavers. And the beavers have escaped and gone everywhere. And the beavers have just done what they've gone and beaved, and they've saved a lot of rivers, and they prevent flooding, which we suffer from in the UK with climate change and climate chaos and extreme weather. So we've got beavers now. So it's not all bad. We are, I mean, I'm an optimist. I'm a concerned optimist, I would describe myself as. And as for Dartmoor, where I live, it's a granite batholith, I think it's called, and the water on the uplands is not polluted because it can't be farmed. So it's not mountains, it's just kind of hilly with big granite outcrops, and the water percolates down and runs off very fast, and there isn't time for any pollution to settle there. It will just get washed out really quickly if there is any, but I think there's very little pollution. And so the rivers are safe for otters. They do get hit by cars on roads, but that's inevitable and a risk they take. They take their chances like all wildlife. But yeah, it's the geography of this granite outcrop and the type of rock which just sends the water down really fast into the rivers and keeps them really, really clean. So we're lucky. We're lucky here.
Here's a question, another question about how many babies they have, who raises them, and how long do they stay with the parent that raises them? So
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So otters, depending on how healthy they are, they will have more cubs. So, but generally an otter in this part of the world has 2 cubs. It may be 3, but otters have a 50% mortality. So around here, if an otter has 2 cubs, only one will survive. It's some kind of insurance policy, I think, that they have more than one. But generally half don't survive. And in terms of how long they stay with their mothers, it's a really complicated life for an otter to learn all the skills it needs to survive. And they generally stay with their mothers, getting trained up for fishing and underwater swimming and survival, generally all the skills they need to survive. It takes about a year for the otter to be fully grown and ready to leave. So they will look like adults by the time they leave their mothers, and the mother in the end has to chase them off like unwanted teenagers, and they come back like once children do. They go off to college, they come back. But for a year they have to stay being trained up till they've got the confidence and the skills to survive.
And it's really the female who raises them, right? The
Oh,
male just mates and then he moves on and might mate with more than one female, and the female's the main raiser.
that's right, absolutely. And also, I mean, we say that the male doesn't have anything to do with the cubs, but actually I've seen the daddy otter come back and see the pups. Now, he may be just checking out whether the female is ready to mate again, but I like to think that there is a bit of paternal interest there as well. And the way they greet one another when they meet with the mother and the cubs and the father is so excited and joyful, and usually if it's the father um intensely happy. It appears to be that, I think, there are more questions to be asked about whether it's just the mother who raises the cubs. And I mean, in science, it's important never to make assumptions, to always be curious and to always ask questions. And we just have to keep asking questions. I haven't got all the answers because there's always going to be something that we don't know. Always. We can guarantee that with otters. So yeah, I mean, I think that generally the rule is that the mother does the work, but I think, there's more to it than that.
Love it. Thank you. I think we might end. People are recognizing that you are up late and you gave us such a fabulous program, such lovely writing. And I do really hope that everybody goes out and gets this book, Otter Country. You will love it. I loved it. It's really my new favorite book. I love Ring of Bright Water, but I love this even more. And
Oh,
Miriam, if you ever come to the States, I hope you'll come to New Hampshire and come to the Harris Center where we can show you some North American river otter spraint and go looking for otters. You're welcome to visit us anytime. We'd love to have you. And thank you everybody who stayed on. People are giving you lots of love in the chat and I'm just really grateful. And Becky, thank you again for reaching out to Miriam and making this happen. And yay, thanks everybody and happy ottering.
thank you so much.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you. I will sleep well tonight.
Please do. It was wonderful. Goodbye.